Good day. I'm going to try to devote most of this program to a discussion of the state of the Russian economy. We've had quite a lot of information about what's happening within the economy within the last couple of days. And I'm also going to look at various articles that have been written on this topic, which have also been appearing, believe it or not, over the last couple of weeks. But before I do that, as always, I'm going to discuss the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. And the first thing to say is that yesterday I was saying that there were reports that the Wagner organization forces had reached the road leading from Chasov Yar through Khromovo into Bakhmut, and that they were actually advancing along this road, and that I also said that this was not yet fully confirmed. Well, we've not had confirmation exactly about this. The Russian Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin himself, the head of the Wagner organization, have not commented about what's actually happening, but we've had something that approaches confirmation, though I would give a sort of health warning. It might not be absolutely accurate, but we've had this comment from Yan Gagin, who is the advisor to the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin. And he told TASS today that Wagner PMC fighters have reached the Artyomovsk, Bakhmut if you prefer, Chasov Yar highway that was used to supply the Ukrainian battle group. They have several hundred meters under control, which makes supplies to the garrison impossible. Thus, the lid of the cauldron is effectively shut. So that's what Gagin is telling us. As I said, I'm not going to say definitely that this is correct, but that is the information that he's giving. And as I said, he is an advisor. He's close to Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk Republic. He presumably, that's to say Pushilin, is well informed about what's going on in Bakhmut, and presumably Gagin is also. There have been other reports. They're all very, very sketchy, not very fully confirmed. But they say that, yes, it is indeed the case that the Wagner forces have indeed occupied stretches of this road and have closed the road. But they also say that in the hours after the Wagner forces captured this part of the road, cut this road, fierce Ukrainian counterattacks, desperate Ukrainian counterattacks took place, trying to push the Wagner forces off the road. Though these reports also say that regardless of what happens with these counterattacks, the road will have continue to remain effectively closed, because with the Wagner forces almost upon it, even if they're pushed off, the road will be to all intents and purposes unusable. Having said that, it's probably better from a Russian point of view to take physical control of the road, and as I said, intense fighting is going on about control of this road, and we'll see what happens. Now, I suspect that it isn't just the Wagner organization forces that are engaged in this battle. Various other forces, no doubt, are. That's to say Russian regular forces, but I'm not able to give details about this. In fact, as several commentators have been pointing out, there's a kind of radio silence at the moment going on about what's going on the battlefronts, which is probably caused by instructions from the relevant commands, the Russian and the Ukrainian command, to stay silent about these events in Bakhmut until one side or the other prevails in this particular battle. Anyway, that's the situation. It's important news if it is true, if the road is indeed cut, and if, as Yan Gagin says, the cauldron is effectively shut, then it looks as if a significant group of Ukrainian troops will be cut off inside Bakhmut. How many they are, I have no idea. There have been all sorts of numbers thrown around at various times. One point it was suggested that there were up to 20,000 Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. I doubt that there are anywhere near that number today, but probably we are talking about a force still in Bakhmut that numbers still in the thousands rather than the hundreds. And if it is indeed cut off from resupply, completely cut off from resupply and reinforcement, and if it is eventually defeated, then this will be a heavy blow for Ukraine, to put it mildly. But there we go. We'll just have to see what happens over the next few hours and what information we receive. I would add that there's also been further information about territorial gains by the Wagner forces within Bakhmut itself. That seems to be going on an incremental basis, literally every day. Some more blocks of buildings are captured by the Wagner forces. But, I don't have exact information other than the railway station. Apparently even Ukraine is admitting that the main railway station is now definitely under Russian control. But as I said, the exact details are elusive. Now, we have had lots of reports of Russian airstrikes across Ukraine, including airstrikes with Uranium-2 drones. There's been a frankly bizarre story about how Ukraine, in December, tried to insert itself into the Syrian war. Apparently, it tried to instigate Kurdish forces to attack Russian forces in Syria, and the idea apparently was to prevent the redeployment of Wagner forces from Syria to the fighting in Ukraine, specifically the fighting in Bakhmut. And apparently these Kurdish forces were supplied with some sort of equipment from Ukraine, drones, other things, no doubt. But somebody apparently eventually decided that this was a bad idea, and the whole operation was called off. There's very little information about this. It is entirely consistent, however, with what Ukraine does, and the information about this venture by Ukraine comes from the US media, which leads one to think that it must be true. Now, I'm going to make a guess that the people who basically said no to this plan, who rejected the idea of involving themselves in this particular plan, in this Ukrainian plan to attack Russian forces in Syria, were the Kurdish militia themselves. They've had historically important ties with Russia. They've now become heavily over-dependent upon the United States. They've been seeing the moves that are taking place in the Middle East, the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the rapprochement between Turkey and Syria, the rapprochement between Syria and Saudi Arabia, and the rapprochement between Egypt and Syria. Now, not all of this would have been public knowledge in December, but it's likely that in the hive of rumours, which is the Middle East, some early reports about what was going on would have been circulating. And I suspect that the Kurdish militia said to themselves that this is a madcap venture. It doesn't really benefit them in any serious way. They have no reason to pull coals out of the fire for Ukraine, certainly no reason to antagonize the Russians in this particular way, given that the position of the United States, their principal sponsor in Syria, is starting to become increasingly brittle, and that the Kurdish militia's own position is becoming more precarious, and they might eventually need to call on the Russians for help at some point in the future. So I suspect that the Kurds might have given some thought to this operation, but they probably eventually turned it down, which is presumably why it didn't happen. Anyway, that's a guess. Probably much more to this story than we know. It's very much in keeping with the, frankly, rather eccentric approach that Ukraine takes to this war in many respects. It's various James Bond type operations, some of which I have to say, in my opinion, cross over the line into outright terrorism. But anyway, it's very much in the style of Ukraine, trying to expand the war, trying to launch the war in all sorts of other places, trying to attack the Russians on their own territory and on their own ground, causing pinprick attacks, which we were told a few weeks ago by the New York Times that the United States government doesn't approve of. Anyway, that's that particular rather odd affair. We've had some comments now from our old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko, formerly of the Lugansk militia, and he doubts that Ukraine is going to be in a position to launch an offensive for at least 2 weeks. He says, after visiting the Donetsk area, I can say that unfavourable weather conditions will prevent the enemy from starting full-scale offensive operations, at least in the coming 2 weeks. This is also unlikely in the Kupiansk and Liman directions. And TASS, where I'm taking this from, goes on to report him saying that the enemy is unable to conduct full-fledged reconnaissance due to low clouds, while a large amount of precipitation, in other words rain, has turned many swathes of land into impassable swamps, making it impossible to use heavy armour on muddy roads. Our positions, significantly reinforced in all ways lately, compel the enemy, in case of an attack, to employ large resources that it presently has to use to prevent our breakthroughs. So that's a Marochko. He's put back any Ukrainian offensive by 2 weeks because of weather conditions. And one is hearing that the weather conditions in Ukraine are not really very favourable to an offensive at this particular time, the kind of offensive that Ukraine has been talking about. Whilst I'm on the subject of the Ukrainian offensive or prospective offensive, I'd like to say that yet again, there's been an excellent video about this on the new Atlas by Brian Beletic, explaining all the various problems that Ukraine will experience, and explaining and pointing out that this article in Foreign Policy by the gentleman from the International Institute of Strategic Studies, who said that Ukraine needed to achieve success within the first 24 hours, and that required paralyzing the Russian leadership and causing the Russian army to panic, that the person who wrote that article is drawing the wrong conclusions from what happened in the Kharkov offensive of the autumn. He appears to believe that the Kharkov offensive was a case when Ukraine achieved just that, paralysis of the Russian leadership and panic amongst the Russian troops. I discussed the offensive at the time, as, by the way, of course, did Brian Beletic. I pointed out that the number of regular Russian military troop units in Kharkov region had been drastically reduced. I doubted that there were as many as 2,000 Russian regular army troops in ETHEREUM, the main base, at the time when Ukraine launched its offensive in Kharkov. And I also pointed out that the defense at the key point, which was Blockade, a small town to the west of ETHEREUM, that the defense there rested entirely on men of the Lugansk militia, supplemented with a number of troops from Russia's Rosgvardia organization, which is an internal security force. It is not regular Russian army. And given the weakness of Russian defenses in Kharkiv, it's unsurprising that the Russians decided to pull out. There simply weren't enough Russian troops there to hold the positions. And in fact, the Russian pullback from Kharkiv, like, by the way, the subsequent Russian pullback from Kherson, in the end, justified itself militarily, because eventually the Ukrainian offensive, after very heavy losses caused by airstrikes and shelling by the Russians, after experiencing very heavy losses, it finally managed to capture the important town of Liman, which was, by the way, garrisoned by just 500 men from the Russian military. But after that, the offensive came to a juddering stop. Now, I just wanted to add 2 points to the ones that Brian Beletic made, which is that even against this very weak resistance, Ukraine was not able to break through. Within 24 hours, the Russian forces in Balakleya, mainly Rosgvardia troops in the end, actually managed to hold out for, by my recollection, rather longer than that, perhaps 2 days, maybe even 3. And there wasn't that kind of, breakthrough at once that this article is talking about. Well, perhaps that's not so important, given that Ukraine, of course, did eventually break through. But there is another point which, of course, needs to be made as well, which is that in Kharkiv region, there were no fortifications, no Russian fortifications whatsoever, despite the fact that there'd been this enormous drawdown of Russian forces. The Russians had neglected to build fortified lines. There were no dragon's teeth, trenches. There weren't even minefields. I remember that there were furious recriminations on Russian telegram channels and in the Russian media about this. Very, very heavy criticism of the Russian Ministry of Defense for allowing a situation like that to arise. So the Ukrainians not only were able to break through in Kharkiv region against very thin Russian forces, but they didn't have to surmount anything that remotely approximates to the kind of fortified lines that the Russians have created both in the south, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and by the way in Crimea as well, and in the north around Kremenaya, Svatovo, and those sort of places. So I think any ideas, any plans for this offensive based on the Kharkiv offensive would be, shall we say, foolhardy. They would be unwise. We are not talking about analogous situations at all. For the record, I think the chances of Ukraine panicking the Russian army or paralyzing the leadership are almost non-existent. And I think that an offensive that gambles on achieving such a thing, and which even the writer of this article appears to think is unlikely to succeed unless these two most improbable eventualities arise. Anyway, I think that an offensive that counts on those things is reckless, to put it mildly. Well, that is my view. I just wanted to make that point for a much more informed analysis of the prospects of that offensive. I would again urge people here to go to the new atlas and to see what Brian Beletic has to say. As I said, he has a military background, and I think his analysis of the war has been exceptionally fine right the way through. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefields. We'll see what happens in Bakhmut. We'll see if the Ukrainians are able to restore the situation in some way. It doesn't look very likely. We'll see if there is a cauldron. We'll see if that cauldron is indeed created. And we're talking about a tight cauldron round now, a proper dense ring. Well, we'll see how long the Ukrainian troops within that cauldron are able to hold out. They don't have the kind of protection that some Ukrainian troops had within the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, into which they were able to withdraw, and which had all its enormous subterranean vaults and bunkers. There's nothing like that in what's left of Bakhmut now. And so they're exposed to artillery fire, to heavy bombing, to all of that kind of thing, wherever it is that they're trying to hold out. We'll see how long they do hold out, and eventually we'll probably get some idea of how many of them there actually are. My guess is probably no more than 1, 2, perhaps 3,000 at the very most, probably less than 3,000. But whatever it is, any number of Ukrainian troops surrounded and forced eventually to surrender, as I presume they will be, well, that will be a blow for Ukraine. Anyway, let's now turn to the topic of the Russian economy. And in fact, as I said, we've had a swathe of economic news. The first is about the grain harvest. We've had the first projections for the size of the grain harvest, and the agriculture minister, Dmitry Patrushev, who I believe, by the way, is the brother of Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Security Council. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, Dmitry Patrushev says that the sowing campaign in Russia is going well, and we're anticipating a good and more importantly balanced harvest. We anticipate that the volume of grain will in 2023 will be around 123 million tons, with wheat around 78 million tons. This will allow us to fully secure national food security, whilst also continuing supplies to our overall overseas partners in the declared volumes. I can so well remember the days in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, when there were all those talks about the problems with the Soviet grain harvests. Weather conditions have been unusual this year. Very mild winter, rather wet spring. Once upon a time, these might have caused problems for Russian agriculture. It seems that Russian agriculture has now reached a level of sophistication and resilience where it can absorb these kind of problems. For the record, I think a harvest of 123 million tons is slightly down on the harvest last year, but as Patrushev says, it will be enough to cover both Russia's domestic needs and its opportunities, its long-term export demands. Anyway, we've now also had information about inflation, and this comes from the Economics Ministry. They say that inflation fell to 0.04% in the week of April 11th to April 17th, 2023. The yearly rate of price growth continued to decline to 2.82% year on year. The biggest contributor to the decreases in inflation was a slowdown in price growth in the service sector, which coincided with the restoration of cheaper domestic air travel tickets, as well as a slowdown in price increase for household services. For the second week in a row, there was no price increase in the non-food group. Prices for food products climbed by 0.08%, while prices for fruits and vegetables also increased. Other food products have seen price growth close to zero. Now, I think this is an important and interesting report. First of all, it should be said that it was universally expected that inflation, the headline rate of inflation in Russia, would tumble in March and April. And this was a statistic caused by statistics. Inflation was very high, as we all know, last year. The sanctions were imposed by the Western powers in February and March. Supplies from the West suddenly stopped. Goods were in short supply and prices surged. And the result was that you had a very high rate of inflation last year. Inflation then stabilized and started to fall back over the course of the rest of 2022. And inevitably, given the very high increases in prices last year, it's unsurprising, even just for mathematical reasons, that we've now seen a tumble. It means that prices today in Russia are only 2.82% higher than they were last April, but of course they were much higher last April than they were in, say, February. Having said that, there are some interesting facts about these statistics. First of all, we are told that inflation is now running at only 0.04% in the week April 11th to April 17th. In other words, the rise in prices over the course of that week was, well, I mean, it's almost a statistical rounding error, 0.04%. We're told that some prices for airline tickets, for example, are falling. And importantly, food prices are fairly static, 0.08%, presumably over the same week. And some food products, that was principally caused by an increase in price in fruit and vegetables. Other food products, prices remained essentially unchanged. In other words, this is a stable situation. Now, I say all of this, we are in a very different economic world today, the world of sanctions. So it's not always easy to predict with confidence what's going to happen from one day to the next. And anyway, it's perhaps unwise to look at recent Russian economic history as a clue to what might happen over the rest of the year, given, as I said, how unusual conditions are. But I would say that generally, Russia experiences price growth in the winter and spring, and price stability or even falls in prices in the summer. The reason that prices tend to fall in the summer is because with the harvest coming in, food prices in the summer in Russia historically have tended to fall. I mean, I can remember several instances where we've had outright deflation over the course of August in particular. In other words, price falls in Russia. So, setting aside the issue of the statistics, the base effect, the fact that price growth is so subdued at the moment in advance of the harvest might suggest that inflation is not going to take off significantly over the course of the year. Most Russian analysts still expect inflation to be above the 4% target overall this year. The economics ministry is still predicting, as I understand it, a 5.3% inflation. The central bank expects it to be a bit higher than that. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. For the moment, as I said, price growth looks very subdued in Russia, which, by the way, may point to still rather subdued demand, but there might be other explanations. Whilst I'm talking about inflation, I will say that in March, we've also had a report that industrial goods producers, prices for industrial goods increased by 2.6% in March. So that was below the rate of inflation, the headline rate of inflation in March. Some prices did rise in March quite significantly, and there were, for example, there was an increase in 6% in prices for internal combustion engines, the kind that go into motor vehicles, 5.6% for motor vehicles, electrical and electronic equipment, and certain types of mineral products also saw significant increases, 31% for diamonds, 24% for quartz and quartzite, 13.8% for nickel, concentrates, 12% for anthracite, etc. So we have seen some price pressure in March from industrial producers. But note again that overall, 2.6% month on month in March doesn't point to a particularly big price surge coming forward, but we'll just have to wait and see. And I would say that we've also had some really rather interesting comments from analysts working for the central bank. Now, the central bank is consistently the most pessimistic economic institution in Russia. The economics ministry tends to be the most optimistic. The finance ministry is somewhere between the economics ministry and the central bank. The central bank tends to be the most pessimistic. Anyway, it has a team of outside analysts, and they've come forward and they've said that they still expect the Russian economy to contract overall this year, but they now think that the GDP contraction this year will be 0.1%, as opposed to the 1.1% that they were predicting in March. And their inflation forecast for the year as a whole is 5.9%. Of course, the economics ministry is more optimistic. It is expecting 1.2% growth this year, and the central bank itself is saying that growth might come in at anywhere between -1% and +1%. But anyway, this survey gives us further reason to think that the Russian economy is in fact returning to growth and might register overall growth figures this year. Now, Nabulina, the central bank chair, has now discussed interest rates. And it's important to say that with inflation, annualized inflation at 2.8% and interest rates at 7.5%, may not be something people understand, but Russia has a very tight monetary policy. In other words, interest rates are well above the annual rate of inflation. Russia has strong positive interest rates, much more so than anywhere in the West. In the West, overall, the nominal interest rates remain below the rate of inflation. In Russia, they are well above. And needless to say, there are now increasing demands from industry that the central bank lower interest rates. And this is what Nabulina has said in reply. She says, in order for there to be room for further rate cuts, it is necessary that pro-inflationary risks subside. The annual inflation rate dropped to 3.5% in March and will drop again in April. However, the current price growth, the seasonally adjusted monthly growth, is close to 4%. Inflation expectations for both households and businesses are higher than they were in 2018-2019. For the record, they're around 10%. Russian households, Russian consumers expect prices to rise by around 10%. They always assume a worse inflation situation than usually comes. This is unsurprising given Russia's long history of very high inflation rates since the Soviet collapsed in 1991. But then Nabulina says inflation expectations for both households and businesses are higher than they were in 2018-2019 when inflation was close to 4%. External conditions also remain complicated. By retaining the key rate at 7.5% per annum in March, the central bank has maintained a hawkish signal, meaning that if pro-inflationary risks rise, then the bank intends to evaluate the advisability of hiking the key rate at the next meeting. And she also says that the balance of risk has not changed substantially over the medium term and that it was still leaning towards pro-inflationary risks. Nabulina has consistently prioritized inflation reduction, but she's now coming under pressure because, as I said, price growth is subdued. 2.8% inflation on an annualized basis. She says that seasonally adjusted monthly growth is close to 4%. Well, we've seen that industrial prices in March appear to rise well below that, 2.6%. But anyway, she's being very careful. I suspect that if inflation continues to go below the worst expectations of the central bank, we will see a rate cut rather than a rate increase over the next few months. And we've had another piece of analysis, this is also from the central bank, which might provide a clue as to why inflation this year is turning out to be less than even the Russians themselves expected, even whilst output and demand are both growing. And I'm taking this now from Interfax, and it reports that the Russian economy, judging by the latest data, is continuing to grow at the same rate that was achieved in the second half of 2022, and this has made it possible to which made it possible to avoid a steep drop in GDP for 2022 after the disastrous second quarter, the central bank's research and forecasting department said in a bulletin on current trends. Statistical indicators confirmed that there was strong growth of economic activity in February. Judging by the latest survey indicators, this has continued in March. Consumer demand grew, fueled by an increase in earned income. The strong expansion of business activity, judging by the latest statistics, continued throughout the first quarter, and GDP growth at the beginning of 2023 might turn out to be comparable to the rates of the second half of 2022. The main contributor to the growth of activity was made by domestic demand, whilst the contribution of exports remained limited. Output by consumer industries remained stable, and the gradual expansion of consumer demand amid rising incomes and falling unemployment might already push the sector into growth in the coming quarters. And at the same time, imports will continue to recover thanks to the increase in supplies of consumer goods from friendly countries. Furthermore, we have reason to believe that the significant change in the structure of supply of consumer goods due to the switch to foreign suppliers from friendly countries or Russian manufacturers that began last year could have led to an overestimation of the depth of the drop in consumer demand and underestimation of the speed of its recovery. So what the central bank is now saying is that the economy in 2022 adjusted much more quickly than the central bank and indeed the Russian government itself realized. Supplies of consumer goods grew faster, both as a result of increased production by domestic Russian manufacturers, import substitution in other words, and imports of goods from friendly countries, India, China, Turkey, Iran, and that as a result, consumer demand might have been higher in 2022 than had been previously assumed. Now that's correct. What we might see is a revision, an upward revision of the GDP figures for 2022. We might find that actual GDP decline was less than the 2.1% that the Russian state, Rosstat, the Russian Statistical Bureau, is currently saying. Now, it has happened before. I remember that at the time of the 2015 recession, the contraction, the original contraction, was put at about, I think, from memory, 3.8%. And then it was discovered that the contraction had been significantly less than previously assumed, and revised figures over the course of 2016 brought that contraction down to 2.2%. It could be that as the Russians work through their statistics, they will find that 2022's GDP contraction, which is currently thought to have been 2.1%, was actually smaller than that. We'll see. Anyway, all of this points to a continuing recovering economy. As I said, we're getting lots of statistics. We are seeing that inflation remains subdued. That is increasing the space for future interest rate cuts. The economy has rebalanced surprisingly successfully, and the collapse of the financial system, the widespread expectations of an overwhelming crisis, they've not been fulfilled. Now, Western governments, to some extent at least, have to be aware of all of this. What they've noticed are a number of things. Firstly, that the Russian economy has not imploded. It's not cratered in the way that they expected it would when they imposed their shock and awe sanctions in February and March. They've tried other things since then. They've banned imports of oil into the European Union. They've restricted imports of gas into the European Union. That's caused problems for the European Union, but it was intended that it would cause bigger problems for Russia. Hasn't done so. Not to anything like the extent that they imagined that it would. Then they imposed price caps on Russian oil products, which they tried to enforce globally. And that hasn't worked either. We see that the Russian economy remains stable. The explosion into the collapse into hyperinflation that was predicted, all of that has failed to occur. So they look for the next magic bullet to kill this resilient beast. And there was a report in Bloomberg yesterday, it's been picked up in a few places, that the latest plan, the new plan, is to replace the sanctions on Russia with an outright embargo, an embargo by the G7. Now, what an embargo would mean is that G7 countries would no longer export goods to Russia. Period. No exports at all, except for certain items, things like medicines and such things, which would be allowed on a case-by-case basis, and there would be lists telling you which items could be sold to Russia and which not. So, whereas today's sanctions tell Western countries and Western governments and Western companies which goods they cannot sell to Russia, they're excluded items. This is going to try to reverse it. It's now going to be a case of the only goods you can export to Russia are the goods which we allow you to. Notice that there's no actual restrictions on imports of goods from Russia. Nothing analogous to that, apart from the sanctions which have already been imposed. And all of this is happening even as the US is now trying as hard as it can to enforce the existing sanctions. It's sending teams of people from the Treasury Department to various countries with all kinds of threats to impose restrictions if they continue to trade with Russia in all sorts of different ways. In other words, get round Western sanctions and presumably this embargo when it comes. Well, what is this embargo going to achieve? The answer is practically nothing. The level of imports from the West to Russia has crashed. It now stands at around $66 billion against an economy which is around $1.4 trillion, according to nominal GDP, $4.8 billion on purchasing power parity terms. And remember, all the key things, the most important things necessary for the functioning of the economy, the Russian economy, have already been restricted. So all this will do will be to hurt the small number of Western exporters who are still trying to export goods to Russia. It will mean, however, that the West is once and truly frozen out of the Russian market. Now, how this is beneficial to the West, given the Chinese, Indian suppliers, and of course they will undoubtedly reject any attempts to pressure them to restrict exports of their own goods. They will not agree to export their own goods. Brazil is likely to take the same stance. Mexico is doing so. Iran, of course. Turkey too, probably. Whatever happens with this coming election in May, just a few weeks away now. Anyway, whatever happens with all of this, most unlikely that the rest of the world will impose this kind of embargo on the Russians. So the Russians can still get their microchips from China, probably Malaysia as well. They're producing their own microchips as well. I know there are all sorts of people who claim that they cannot do so. I've already explained many times why this is an absurd idea. Anyway, all that's going to happen is that it is going to accelerate Russian import substitution processes and the creation of an alternative global trading supply system, because countries around the world will want to import oil and gas from Russia. The US accepts that Russian oil exports are essential to keep energy prices under control. And the result is that those countries which import Russian oil and gas will not want to run impossibly high trade surpluses with Russia. They will want to export their own goods to Russia in replacement, in order to balance their trade. And in the meantime, what all this will do has been explained rather wonderfully by an article by the American economist James K. Galbraith. Now, I should say that I've learnt about this article from James K. Galbraith. It's one of those articles that Jeff Roberts, the historian, circulates every week or so. He provides he sends a sort of round robin email with links to various articles that he's seen which are of interest, and it's thanks to this that I have learnt about this article, and it is by Galbraith. Now, Galbraith, as I said, is somebody who is, let's say, opposed to the neoliberal school of economics, and he takes a quizzical view about sanctions, and he says that I'm not going to read the entire article, but he makes the following point. He says, a technical analyst from a senior economist at the US Treasury Department examines the effects of sanctions on Russia's long-term economic prospects. And this may be taken as representative of the official view, including one surmises intelligence assessments. And this person, this economist, predicts that this will cause a grim decline in Russia's prospects, such as that the economy by 2030 will be 20% smaller than it would otherwise have been. But then Galbraith says this application of growth theory appears to neglect two basic mainstream concepts: the profit motive and possibilities for technical substitution. By vastly reducing the presence of non-Russian firms on Russian soil, whilst restricting energy and other resource exports from Russia, so that resource prices within Russia have remained stable, sanctions have had a favourable effect on the potential profitability of Russian businesses. The Treasury assessment states that Russian firms will not be capable of taking advantage of this potential. But there is no evidence for this view, other than perhaps impressions of the Soviet past and the chaos of the early transition years, in other words, the 1990s. Such impressions are now decades out of date. And then Galbraith contrasts this analysis with a more optimistic one from the Russian Academy of Sciences. He also makes the further point that the contrast between the effect of sanctions on Russia and their effects on Europe is worth noting. With respect to Russia, resource prices remained stable, the internal market for Russian firms grew, physical assets were transferred to Russians at preferential rates, and financial assets were retained in the country which might have gone abroad. With respect to Europe, imported resource prices soared, markets for exports fell, physical assets had to be sold cheaply, and financial assets fled to the United States. Thus, one would expect improved market conditions in Russia and deterioration in Europe, and that is what we presently observe. And then he goes on to say, could Russia have achieved such effects on its own? And he doubts it, because he says the oligarchs, deeply westernized, with vast investments and assets outside the country, were highly influential, whilst the Russian economy was deeply penetrated by foreign firms in all sectors other than the military. Neoliberal economic ideas were prominent, with challenges from academic institutions favouring stronger state industrial policy, still at that time in a relatively weak position. The legal, political, institutional and ideological climate would almost certainly have prevented the Russian state from taking these steps that were imposed upon it by the sanctions. But that, by the way, I'm not so sure, but I think it would certainly not have happened at the speed, with the speed we are now seeing. And then he goes on to say, this is Galbraith, we conclude that when applied to a large, resource-rich, technically proficient economy, after a period of shock and adjustments, sanctions are isomorphic to a strict policy of trade protection, industrial policy, and capital controls. Such policies have been applied with success in other countries. And he doesn't name those other countries, but of course one of them, for the record, was the United States in its greatest period of expansion under the so-called American system, from roughly the 1860s, when the American system was basically created by the Lincoln administration, all the way up to and beyond the Second World War. I agree with Galbraith. Now, I know that Galbraith has his detractors. He's not somebody who neoliberal economists think much of, but what we see is what we see. Trends at the moment seem to support what Galbraith is saying. So we have an article that sets things out in that kind of way. We've also, by the way, had a rather more stronger article by Patricia Adams and Lawrence Solomon. Patricia Adams, by the way, is also an economist like Galbraith, and this is in the American Thinker. And by the way, this article I have also seen, thanks to Jeff Roberts. Anyway, she says that the West's sweeping sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine are shaping up to be the West's most monumental miscalculation in modern history. The sanctions have not brought the Russian economy to its knees. Instead, it's Western economies that are reeling, with their economic growth having all but stopped. And then she ticks off, these two tick off the figures. According to the IMF, the Russian economy will grow faster than Germany's or the UK's this year. Next year, it will grow faster than those of the US, Japan, Italy, and much of the West. It will achieve the lowest debt to GDP ratio amongst G20 nations. That is true. Its unemployment rate of 3.5% is now the lowest since the Soviet Union fell. And Russia's economic performance, S&P Global, recently confirmed its bullish private sector business confidence is all the more remarkable since Russia is simultaneously fighting an expensive proxy war against the combined weight of the armories of the West. All of which is true, perhaps put it rather more euphorically than I would do. The article also mentions that the Russians have been able to out-manufacture the West in terms of weapons production. They're outproducing the West in key weapon systems, shells, tanks. Well, I've discussed all that many times. Bombs, I suspect, as well. Now, that brings me now to the final article in this series, which I propose to read. And it is different from all the articles I've been reading from up to now, because this one comes from a magazine which is about as mainstream as it gets in the United States, which is National Interest. And this article published on the April 17th, 2023, says, can we please stop comparing Russia's economy to Italy? The comparison is not only wrong, it betrays Western policymakers' blindness to material realities. And then he goes on to say this soundbite depressingly has informed and shaped our approach to Russia, and it is high time we abandon it. If Russia's economy were as small and unimpressive as the statistics suggest, how could it withstand the sanctions imposed on it? Why has, President Biden's declaration that it would be cut in half failed to materialize? And it goes on to quote what various Western officials have been saying, none of which has been true. It then makes the point that one of the fundamental misconceptions is to try to measure Russia's GDP in nominal terms. In other words, convert it on the basis of the ruble conversion rate to the dollar. That gives it an economy, relatively small economy, of only $1.78 trillion. Whereas if measured in purchasing power parity terms, much more accurate, looking at taking into account differences, trying to take into account differences in prices, well, then it grows to $4.81 trillion, which is about the same as Germany's. And then it goes on to say, even these PPP figures do not fully capture the significance of Russia's economic power. And he quotes an economist, Jacques Sapir, whom I have a great deal of respect for, by the way. And anyway, Sapir explained, this is in an essay that he wrote for American Affairs a while back, in which he said that PPP measurement may not yet reflect the real importance of the Russian economy when strategic geopolitical issues are at stake. And Sapir notes that over the past 50 years, Western economies have become increasingly dominated by service sectors, which, while contributing to GDP calculations, lose their importance during times of conflict. In such situations, it is the production of physical goods that matters, and by this measure, Russia's economy is not only stronger than Germany's, but also more than twice as robust as France's. And then he ticks off the various commodities in which Russia is dominant, and the fact that this provides Russia with leverage over many nations in the global south. And he then says that the inability of Western policymakers, this article says, the inability of Western policymakers to understand all of this has been remarkable and is probably caused by this love for the service sector, which results in a tendency to view labour-intensive industries of the past, energy, agriculture, resources extraction, manufacturing, as antiquated relics. And it is high time that we admit how much we severely underestimated the relative size and power of rival economies, including and especially Russia's. It would also behoove policymakers to re-evaluate their current policy approach to economic statecraft. Sanctions are not a one-size-fits-all solution, particularly when dealing with a nation that wields significant economic power. But above all, let us resolve never again to utter the words, Russia has an economy the size of Italy. And the writer of this article is Carlos Roa, who is none other than the executive editor of National Interest. I have been making this point that the size of the Russian economy has been hugely underestimated in the West since about the time of the 2008 crisis. And it's refreshing, though rather belated, to see some people in the West finally, very grudgingly, waking up to the fact. I would add that, in my opinion, in some respects, not all respects, in some respects, Russia has a better balanced economy than many Western economies are. Certainly, it has a very large energy sector, but it also has a substantial manufacturing industry, which is probably going to strengthen in size, and it has a very substantial service sector as well. Each of these branches of the economy within Russia complement and support each other, whereas an economy like Britain, for example, is now heavily over-dependent on services, and Germany is over-dependent on manufacturing exports. Just to say, Russia also has a very advanced science and technology base, which will probably get more advanced over the years as investments in it increase. So it's a bigger economy than many in the West imagine, and a more balanced economy than many in the West imagine, a more diversified economy than many in the West imagine, which is why it has been able to navigate successfully through the sanctions storm, with the possible outcome that it will end up with the kind of economic model imposed upon it, which made countries, perhaps the closest analogy to it being the United States, countries like the United States, boom, when it was applied to them in the late 19th century and early first half of the 20th century. So, there we go. Now, is this something that Western commentators are able to understand? I strongly doubt it. Admitting that Russia's economy is much bigger, far stronger than people in the West have realized, policymakers in the West have realized, that there was a massive miscalculation when the sanctions were imposed, that this was perhaps the biggest intelligence failure, the biggest policy and analytical failure of the 21st century, and perhaps going all the way back to the Second World War. Well, that, I think, is something that Western leaders are just not capable of acknowledging. And that is why we're seeing ever more bizarre and outlandish ideas, like this idea now of imposing a blockade, an embargo on exports of one of the biggest economies in the world, losing Western leverage, losing a big market for Western producers, decoupling increasingly the West from Russia at a time when the rest of the world wants to decouple from the West, increasingly wants to decouple from the West. Now, Janet Yellen, who perhaps amongst all Western policymakers sometimes has a glimmer of realities, more than some of the others, which isn't saying much, has just made a long speech in which she said that decoupling from China is simply would be catastrophic. Not only China, I might add, but if she's right, and if the West can't really decouple from China, how do they expect to make an economic blockade on Russia work? Anyway, with that, I'm going to finish this video. More to say soon. I'm still intending to do a follow-up on Sudan, but I'm going to leave that till tomorrow's program. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. We'll see what the situation in Bakhmut actually is. And in the meantime, just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop, buy yourself the things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, and more from me soon.